So I have sort of a severe dislike for titles in the form of questions like this that have no answers, because normally the author knows the answer, but just isn't giving it to you. In this case, I don't have the answer to this question. And this is a question, what is developmental about identity development, that I ask myself pretty much every day. I try to think about this. What is developmental? When we talk about identity development, what do we mean by that? And I don't think as a field you really know what it is that's developing. So the talk I prepared today is to try to offer some preliminary answers to what it might mean for an identity to develop. Now I turn this on. Oh, okay. So here's a picture of me. It's about 4 years old. I'm wearing the exact same white shirt. I'm wearing almost the same blue sweater. Very similar. I've lost the tie. However, my hair is a little longer and unruly. My beard is a little more scraggly, right? So you could make some conclusions about how I've changed in 4 years, right? In some ways, I'm obviously very similar. I look a lot alike, but I've changed in some ways as well, right? So this is the fundamental issue of identity, is how do we both change over time and maintain our stability. But also, how am I different from this person, or that person, or this one, or that one, or all these other different people who inhabit our space and live in our society? What is unique about all these people? And you'll notice that many of these are celebrities because they're the ones whose yearbook photos are readily available online. So you can see, try to guess who's who on there. But so we wonder, the question of identity is how are these people unique? But the question of identity development is how do these people become who they are? And that's really a unique question. I think the issue of identity is one that's taken up by almost every discipline, academic and scholarly and artistic discipline you can think of. You have psychology, sociology, social work, anthropology, theater, various visual arts. They're all asking questions about identity. But developmentalists are particularly concerned with development. How did we get there? And I think arguably no one has spent more time thinking about this question than this man, Erikson, who's been referred to as identity's architect by his biography. Now, when many people associate Erikson with identity, how many of you have heard the term identity crisis? Pretty much everybody. How many of you are aware that Erikson coined that term, identity crisis? Pretty good number, as you should, hopefully, but a smaller number. Prior to Erikson, there actually was no recognized phenomenon called the identity crisis. He observed this happening in his clinical work, he gave it the title, and it became a cultural phenomenon. Now it's part of our everyday nomenclature. In fact, it's something that's expected that adolescents might go through this identity crisis. And Erikson wrote extensively about identity, and poetically about identity, really powerful writing. But I feel like Erikson today would be sadder if he saw the state of identity. And as Manfred said, this is not meant to be insulting anybody or being negative to researchers, but I'm also criticizing my own work that I've done in the past. But I think the last 40, 50 years of identity research has really strayed far away from what Erikson originally wrote about and the kinds of ideas that he discussed. And I think it's time that we get back to Erikson and try to investigate more fully the kinds of things that he talked about. Now, most people know Erikson well for his psychosocial theory of development. I give talks sometimes in the community and to people outside of psychology, and this is something that pretty much everyone's familiar with. A lot of people who have had some sort of formal schooling have had exposure to these 8 stages that they're often referred to. This is another way in which I think Erikson would be sad in the way we think about the way he talked about his theory. So we identify identity versus confusion as this key period in adolescence, maybe emerging adulthood as well. But if you look at any introductory textbook in psychology or in developmental psychology, it will give the impression that identity is only occurring in adolescence, and that by the end of adolescence, identity has been completed or achieved or finished or stabilized, or whatever term you want to use. That each of these stages actually represents or corresponds to one aspect of the lifespan. However, a more accurate depiction of Erikson's theory would look more like this, in which all of the stages, or all of the tensions, more accurately, are present and occurring at all aspects of development. So all of these tensions are occurring at all aspects of development, but at certain periods, one of these tensions takes center stage. So identity does take center stage in adolescence, but identity issues occur much earlier in childhood and continue to go on into adulthood. So identity continues, we have this more lifespan understanding of identity. And whenever I talk talk about this and try to communicate it to people who are familiar, I use the example of trust. Right? Trust versus mistrust. Obviously, infancy and the very beginnings of life are a critical period for understanding or for developing a sense of trust in caregivers and one's environment. But trust issues continue throughout our lives. Right? We're always wrestling with trusting people and trusting our environments. Ideally, we are able to manage those tensions as we approach them based on our early foundations. But they never go away, and that's true for all of us. So how do we really think about identity as a lifespan endeavor? I don't think we know. There has not been a lot of research into this question. There's been some, not even a lot of theorizing, not a lot of speculating. We really don't know what does it mean to have a lifespan understanding of identity. My own reading of Erikson, and as well as the empirical research that's out there that pulled together, leads me to one single word that for me currently answers the question, what's developmental about identity development? And that word is integration. I find integration to be a powerful word. It suggests that there's something disparate that then has to come together and have some sort of unity or cohesiveness. So it implies movement, it implies development. Something has to be separate to be integrated. And if you truly think about what is developing, what is identity development, it is a lifespan series of integrations, a series of integrations. So I'm going to give you some examples of this and how it looks at each part of the lifespan. So if you start from infancy, taking a very Piagetian view of things, you have this distinction between the mind and the body. That one of the prime developmental tasks of infancy is to coordinate physical actions with thoughts and understandings of one's environment. One of the ways you see this is in the mirror self-recognition task. Early on, before 18 months, the child thinks it's another baby in the mirror. After 18 months, the child understands that's not another child in the mirror, but that's in fact me in the mirror. And so identifying oneself in the mirror is an early indicator of this developing sense of self that occurs towards the end of the second year. Now, as children get older, in their early childhood, they have this sense of self that's then developed. They're sort of aware of themselves in their environments. And as they progress, then the main task of integration is to integrate who they are with other people, the others in their environment. So you can think of this in classic psychoanalytic terms of identification, but also about understanding how an individual is a member of a group. So there's plenty of research showing early awareness of being part of a gender group, being part of a racial or ethnic group. Also, if you talk to young children and you ask them, what do you like? Who are you? A lot of what they'll tell you is about activities, things they do with other people. In fact, it's quite a sophisticated way to think about identity. There's a lot of arguments in some circles that identity is about what you do, not what you have in here, but how you act. And that's the way many young children view their identities, if you ask them directly. So this increasing connection or integration of other people in the environment, other groups, individuals, whoever, into the sense of self. To simplify things, I'm just going to remove the other circles, but from here on out, other is integrated into the self. Now we're getting into later childhood and early adolescence, and the self becomes more complicated, more complex, more differentiated. And in particular, you have these three broad dimensions of identity that are often referenced. The cognitive dimension, how do people think about who they are? The affective dimension, how do they feel about who they are? And the behavioral dimension, what do they do to enact or display or showcase those identities? So these are three broad domains that, of course, you can break down into sub-domains if you wanted to. We're going to keep it simple for now. And you have these domains, and the emergence of adolescence is when you really start seeing this differentiation of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And ideally, across adolescence, you start to see some integration between, for example, the cognitive and affective domains. So I came of age during the late 90s and, late 80s and early 90s. And I was very into music, so of course I was fascinated by grunge music, and it really shaped who I was as an adolescent. And I thought of myself as being in a band, as a guitarist and a lead singer. And I felt like I was in a band. When I was in my room, I sounded like Eddie Vedder. And I could belt it out like Chris Cornell. I was that person. But I had no behaviors whatsoever that went with it. I didn't play an instrument, I would never sing publicly. The singing only happened in my room, and I sounded just like this. My friend, similarly, one of my good friends would always say that he sounded exactly like Axl Rose, but only in the shower. So only in certain contexts, right? So you have the cognitive, the affective, but not the behavior. And if you don't have the behavioral domain, ultimately that identity will probably have to be dropped in favor of another, because the behavior also has to have this coordination with the cognitive and affective. Eventually, I wasn't interested in putting the time into learning guitar or how to sing, and so I no longer thought of myself as a musician. That's an identity that I abandoned in favor of other, more reasonably attained types of identities. So now we have this coordination between behavioral, cognitive, and affective dimensions. Now, through adolescence, you have the three of these interacting with one another and sort of plugging along, but a number of domains show up, such as love, and work, and religion, and politics, and friendships, and ethnicity, and gender, and on sexuality. You can go on and on and on to all these identity domains. So not only do you have to coordinate how you think, feel, and behave, and what that means for your identity, but each of those things have to be coordinated within each of these different identity domains. And there's sort of endless possible identity domains that can be investigated. This, in my opinion, again, with all due respect, has been a major failure of the identity development research, is considering these domains, the importance of these domains, and the role of these different domains in the identity development process. Those of you who are unfamiliar with the general state of the literature, typically these domains will be assessed, but then will be sort of aggregated across domains so you get a general sense of what their identity is, general identity. But not really looking at what are the domains, how are they related to identity development that pop up at this time. So as going into mid-adolescence and toward late adolescence, you have multiple identity domains. I just chose 3 here because I'm working on a 2-dimensional space, so there's only so much I can show at once. And so I chose love, work, and ethnicity. You should think of each of these as having cognitive, affective, and behavioral components sort of embedded in them. Okay. So during adolescence, you have these different domains, and they pretty much just trudge along in isolation. So the individuals develop a sense of love, a sense of work, their ethnic identity perhaps, but they're all by themselves. They don't interact with one another. So the domains are developed in parallel to one another. Throughout adolescence and into emerging adulthood, it's in emerging adulthood where you start seeing society and social contexts that require the coordination and integration of these different domains. So love and work, I received some advice as an early graduate student that it was very important that I partner up with somebody who will understand my working conditions. If I'm going to be an academic, most academics, like not all, don't sort of have fixed hours in which they work. You're never caught up. You don't leave home at the end of the day and leave your work behind, right? This is familiar to a lot of people probably. And so I was told, you make sure that you get in a romantic relationship with somebody who understands that. Ideally, who also does that. Someone who's also an academic, or a doctor, or a lawyer, or somebody who understands sort of non-normal life path, non-normal sort of schedules of work. So it's an emerging interaction of love and work. Similar ethnicity, if that's a topic, an identity domain that's important for somebody, is one that also may be integrated with, for example, love or work. So if your ethnic identity is really important to who you are, it might be important for you to choose a romantic partner who shares similar cultural values and maybe comes from the same cultural background as you do. These are just 3 domains that I chose at semi-random. Again, what domains they are doesn't really matter. It is unique to the individual. In terms of this integration of multiple domains, it's only for domains that people actually view as important. Right? So if love's not important to you, that's not going to be something that you need to feel integrates with the rest of who you are. But if it is important to you, then it is something that will need to be integrated. And so what you see in emerging adulthood is, again, sort of this trudging along of this integrated identity. It's becoming a more and more integrated sense of self. And this identity configuration moves on. It doesn't mean nothing changes, but it moves on into adulthood. So in adulthood, you have the sense of integration. You feel like a solid person. You know who you are. You know where you're going. So it's at the end of the story. I say no, it's not. When you get into adulthood, there are other things that happen that can maybe make you rethink and reconsider your identity. Things like having children, changing jobs, moving, premature death of a loved one. Right? These are all potential challenges to our identity. So even if I feel like all the different parts of myself go together, having a child or moving or something like that could really be a potential disruption to how I view myself. And it's something that I have to deal with. And it could fundamentally change my identity. But if I have developed a sense of integration amongst the different domains, I should be able to weather those challenges in my life fairly well. I should be able to assimilate those into my sense of self. Interestingly, in adulthood, the thing is, it's not institutionalized. The identity development issues that occur in adulthood. In childhood, first quarter of life, in schooling, that really dictates, the way in which we develop and the pace at which we develop. But once we get into adulthood, it's sort of free reign. People don't have children at the same time, they don't change jobs at the same time. These things are normative and non-normative life events that just occur. So it's hard to really have a developmental sort of approach to adult identity development because there's not going to be a regular path. It sort of depends on when these life events occur. So putting this all together, I created this little schematic that shows everything I just showed you, but all at one time. So what we see is the mind and body connection coming together to create the self. From that is the integration of the other into the self. Then there's the cognitive, affective, and behavioral components that must come together to have integration, then bombardment of different domains into the identity. You have these several identity domains that then themselves have to be integrated into one another. And then you have this reasonably coherent sense of self that can withstand whatever challenges or experiences that people have in their environments. This is just to see it a little bit more quickly, one more time. And you should see there's a pattern to what's happening here. Right? There's a pattern. There's sort of these disruptions in the sense of integration followed by these dispersions. So if I put it all together at once, so you can see what it looks like, there's a periods of integration followed by disruptions and maintenance and integration and disruptions and maintenance and disruptions. And so it's a constant sort of sense of developing this sense of integrating the things that are important at that time. So each one's developmentally specific, but it's always is integrating these different aspects of the self. Putting a little bit of structure, we're almost out of time, so I'll finish up. Putting some structure into the lifespan, you can see that each sort of period of the lifespan has particular integration challenges that people might face. So if we look at emerging adulthood, from my perspective, the chief integration challenge is to pull together all the different domains and life spaces that we occupy into a coherent whole. And the failure to be able to do that is where you would potentially see some disruptions in psychological function. So the bottom line of what I'm saying here is integration. That's the word to take home. If you think about, there's one potential answer to the question, what's developing in identity development, that's not just limited to an adolescent period, emerging adult period, but truly a lifespan way of thinking about identity. And although Erikson is sad about quite a bit, I actually think personally that he would be happy about the kinds of things that I'm talking about. It's happier. Thanks a lot.